Some crimes don't just shock a town, they leave scars that never heal. This is one of those stories. Imagine living in a peaceful, quiet place where everyone knows each other, where crime is almost unheard of until one brutal discovery turns everything upside down. On a cold January morning in Green Hollow, Wyoming, a town nestled near the Bighorn Mountains, a local park ranger stumbled upon something that no one could have predicted: two bodies, a man and a woman, lying lifeless in a remote cabin. Their deaths weren't just violent, they were gruesome, brutal, and personal. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about murder, it's about betrayal, secrets, and the lengths some will go to keep their darkest sins hidden. Buckle up, because what happened in Green Hollow will haunt you long after you hear the final details. As the investigation into the gruesome murders at the remote cabin began, it didn't take long for the authorities to identify the victims. The woman, Jennifer Morrow, was 44 years old, a longtime resident of Green Hollow. Well known in the small community, she ran the town's only diner, a place where locals would gather to catch up over coffee or grab a hearty breakfast. Jennifer had lived a quiet life, raising her daughter, Lila, on her own since the untimely death of her husband in a car accident more than a decade earlier. She was seen as a strong, independent woman, deeply connected to the town and her family. The other victim, 25-year-old Jake Hanson, was a more recent addition to the Green Hollow community. A handsome and charming mechanic, Jake had moved to the area just 3 years before the murders. He was quickly embraced by the locals, especially after he began dating Lila Morrow, Jennifer's daughter. Their relationship had seemed like the perfect match to outsiders, and although there were whispers of occasional arguments, no one ever imagined anything beyond the usual ups and downs of young love. But as the investigators connected the dots, a shocking and deeply uncomfortable revelation surfaced. Jake wasn't just Leela's boyfriend. His relationship with Jennifer, her mother, had crossed lines that should have never been crossed. It was soon uncovered that Jennifer and Jake had been engaged in a secret affair, a betrayal that not only devastated the people closest to them, but also sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. Jennifer was not supposed to be at that cabin. The cabin itself, isolated and hidden among the tall pine trees, had been rented by Jake under a fake name, a fact that raised immediate red flags with the investigators. Jake's phone records showed that the cabin had become a discreet meeting place for him and Jennifer in the months leading up to the murders, a fact that would later prove critical as the investigation unfolded. At first, the police considered the possibility that this was a random break-in, maybe a robbery gone wrong. After all, the remote location made the cabin an easy target. But as more evidence emerged, it became clear that this was not a crime of opportunity. The brutal nature of the killings, the secluded location, and the victims' connection to one another pointed to something much more sinister. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was personal, very personal. The discovery of this twisted relationship between Jennifer and Jake added an entirely new dimension to the case. Investigators now had to consider motives beyond the typical jealousy, betrayal, revenge. But who would have had the motive to commit such a violent and calculated crime? Was it Leela, the daughter who had been so deeply betrayed by the two people she trusted the most? Or was there someone else in the shadows, someone with their own reason to see both Jennifer and Jake dead? As the community of Green Hollow grappled with the horrifying reality of what had been uncovered, the police were left with more questions than answers. This small town crime had now taken a dark and unexpected turn, and nothing about it was going to be simple. The investigation was only just beginning, but the detectives already had a gut feeling. The key to solving this case lay in the complicated and tangled web of relationships between Jennifer, Jake, and Lila. Green Hollow, Wyoming is the kind of place that could be easily overlooked by anyone passing through. Tucked away near the Bighorn Mountains, the town's population hovers just below 800 residents, a close knit community where everyone knows each other by name and secrets are thought to be rare. Life in Green Hollow moves slowly, like the rivers that wind through the nearby hills, with quiet routines defining the days of the people who call it home. It's the kind of place where the main street has one grocery store, a gas station, and the local diner Morrow's Diner, owned and operated by Jennifer Morrow. For years, that diner had been the heartbeat of Green Hollow. Morrow's Diner wasn't just a place to grab a bite, it was the unofficial town center where locals would meet up after church on Sundays or grab breakfast before heading out to the fields or nearby mines. Jennifer had built a strong reputation for being warm, friendly, and hardworking. Always in her apron with a smile on her face, she knew everyone's favorite orders and would often be caught in long conversations with regulars who considered her more of a friend than just the woman behind the counter. Jennifer's story, like many in Green Hollow, was one of resilience. She had been a widow for almost 10 years, ever since her husband had been killed in a tragic farming accident. He'd been working late on their small family farm when his tractor overturned, trapping him beneath it. The shock of his death sent ripples through the town, and for a while, Jennifer and Lila became the focal points of everyone's concern. But Jennifer, ever the strong willed woman, took on the role of both mother and father to Lila, raising her daughter with a determination that impressed everyone in the town. She continued to run the diner and care for their small piece of land, though she eventually sold the farm, choosing to focus on her business and daughter. To those who knew her, Jennifer was a model of responsibility and dedication. She never missed a shift at the diner, and despite the long hours, she always made time for Lila, ensuring that her daughter had every opportunity to escape the quiet life of Green Hollow if she wanted to. Jennifer's sacrifices for Lila were well known, and many in town saw the two of them as inseparable, bound together not just by their family ties, but by the shared grief of losing Lila's father. Despite her grief and the trials of single motherhood, Jennifer kept a spotless reputation in town. She wasn't one for gossip, and she certainly wasn't the type to involve herself in any scandals. To outsiders, her life seemed predictable and steady, with the diner being her main focus. She had her fair share of admirers. Of course, many local men had been drawn to her warmth and quiet beauty, but she never seemed to entertain the idea of moving on from her late husband. Most believed that Jennifer was simply too focused on Leela and the diner to even think about dating again. No one, not her closest friends, nor her regulars at the diner, would have ever suspected that she was harboring any kind of secret. In a town as small as Green Hollow, secrets don't stay hidden for long. Affairs, betrayals, and lies have a way of bubbling up to the surface, especially when everyone's lives are so deeply intertwined. Yet Jennifer had managed to keep her affair with Jake Hanson, a man more than 20 years her junior, and worse, her daughter's boyfriend, completely concealed. The very idea of it was unthinkable to the people who knew her. To them, Jennifer was the last person who would ever become involved in something so reckless, so dangerous. The affair, when it came to light after the murders, sent shockwaves through Green Hollow. People who had known Jennifer for decades found themselves questioning how well they truly knew her. The woman who had seemed so solid, so dependable, had, in secret, been living a double life that none of them could have ever imagined. And as those dark secrets began to unravel, it became clear that this quiet town wasn't as peaceful or simple as everyone once believed. In a place like Green Hollow, the line between public and private lives is thin, but Jennifer had managed to walk that line for months without anyone noticing. Now, with two bodies lying in that remote cabin, the town would have to come to terms with the truth. Even in the quietest corners of the world, people are capable of unspeakable things. And in this case, the betrayal was so profound that it left two people dead and an entire community in disbelief. Lila Morrow had always been seen as the town's golden girl, bright, driven, and full of potential. Unlike many of her peers who seemed content with the quiet, slow paced life of Green Hollow, Lila had dreams that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the small Wyoming town. Having recently graduated from a nearby community college, she was at a crossroads in her life. Her plan was to save up enough money to move to a bigger city, possibly Denver, where she could pursue a career in marketing or communications. She was ambitious, and everyone who knew her believed she had what it took to make something of herself. For the past year, Leela had been dating Jake Hanson, the town's charismatic mechanic who had become somewhat of a local heartthrob. From the outside looking in, their relationship seemed perfect. Jake, with his easy smile and laid back charm, complemented Leela's more serious and focused nature. They were often seen together at local events, the town's annual fair, church picnics, or even just grabbing a coffee at her mother's diner. To their friends and neighbors, they were the kind of couple that just seemed to fit, a bright spot in an otherwise quiet town. Despite her plans to leave Green Hollow eventually, Leela hadn't yet made the jump to the big city. She was still living at home with her mother Jennifer while she saved up and figured out her next steps. Jennifer's diner provided Leela with some financial stability as she worked part time, but more than that, her mother's support was invaluable. Jennifer had always been Leela's rock, especially after the death of Leela's father. The two had weathered that tragedy together, growing even closer in the years since, and Leela often confided in her mother about everything, her dreams, her frustrations, even her relationship with Jake. In fact, it was Jake's sudden involvement in her life that had brought Leela some unexpected joy. She'd been hesitant about dating him at first. He was older and had a bit of a reputation for being a flirt. But over time, Jake won her over, and they quickly became the couple everyone thought would go the distance. Leela's close friends said she was smitten, despite the occasional fights and disagreements that come with any relationship. Jake had been her anchor in a period of transition, and for Leela, their relationship represented a rare sense of stability. That's what made the news of the affair so much more devastating. When the bodies of Jake and her mother were discovered, Leela was immediately brought in for questioning. As the immediate next of kin, her cooperation was crucial in understanding the dynamics of what had happened. Sitting in the small, dimly lit interview room at the Green Hollow Sheriff's office, Leela appeared completely shattered. She wore the weight of her grief on her face, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands trembling as she answered the detective's questions. She was barely holding herself together, but she was cooperative, answering every question as best as she could. The detectives asked her about her relationship with Jake, about her mother's whereabouts leading up to the murder, and whether she had noticed anything suspicious in the days before the bodies were found. Leela insisted that she had no idea her mother had been seeing Jake behind her back. The very idea seemed too horrific for her to process. The detectives noted that she seemed genuinely shocked by the discovery of the affair, her emotions ranging from confusion to fury as the reality set in. How could her mother, the one person she trusted most in the world, betray her like this? Despite her heartbreak, Leela did her best to remain composed. She told the police that she hadn't seen Jake for a couple of days prior to the murders. They had been arguing, nothing too serious, she claimed, but it wasn't unusual for them to have spats. She chalked it up to Jake's reluctance to support her plans to leave Green Hollow. He wanted her to stay, to settle down with him, but Leela had bigger dreams. That disagreement had led to some tension, but it was nothing that suggested violence, at least not to Leela. The detectives pressed her on whether she had noticed anything off with her mother's behavior in recent weeks. Leela thought back, recounting her mother's growing preoccupation with the diner and her own life, but there was nothing that seemed too strange. Jennifer had always been busy, always focused on work, and Leela had assumed that her mother's occasional late nights were just part of the job. She had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined that her mother could be involved in an affair with Jake. The interview lasted hours, but despite the painful questions, Leela remained composed. The detectives couldn't ignore the fact that she was the person most directly affected by the affair. They knew that emotions run high in cases of betrayal, and a crime of passion wasn't out of the question. Still, as far as they could tell, Leela didn't show any signs of hiding something. Her alibi seemed solid, and she was open and forthcoming with the information they asked for. She even expressed disbelief at the very idea that her mother and Jake could have been romantically involved. But as the detectives dug deeper, the cracks in the story began to show. Leela's outward cooperation and composure were noted, but there was something underneath the surface, a tension that suggested more than just grief. Could it be possible that Leela's heartbreak had turned into something darker, something violent? The investigators weren't sure yet, but they knew one thing: the seemingly perfect world Leela had built with her mother and Jake had been shattered, and it would take more than just words to uncover the full truth. Leela's calm demeanor during the interview would later be scrutinized in the courtroom, where every detail of her emotional state would come under the microscope. But for now, she remained the grieving daughter and betrayed girlfriend, caught in the middle of a nightmare that was far from over. Jake Hanson was the kind of man who, in a small town like Green Hollow, quickly made an impression. Standing just over 6 feet tall, with rugged good looks and a confident smile, he had an air of easy charm that made him both likable and a bit of a mystery. Jake had moved to Green Hollow only 3 years before the murders, seeking a fresh start after leaving his hometown in Idaho. The reasons for his move weren't well known, but in a town like Green Hollow, people didn't ask too many questions. What mattered was that he fit in quickly, finding work as a mechanic at the town's only auto shop, where he became known for his skill with engines and his friendly, approachable nature. To the people of Green Hollow, Jake was a drifter with a good heart. He was the kind of guy who could share a beer with the older men after a long day's work or joke around with the high school kids who brought in their beat up cars for repairs. There wasn't a person in town who hadn't seen Jake lend a hand, whether it was fixing a flat tire on the side of the road or helping the local farmers with their equipment. In a town where trust was built on character, Jake earned his place in the community by being dependable, helpful, and above all charming. But Jake's charm wasn't without its complications. Known for his flirtatious nature, he had caught the eye of more than a few women in Green Hollow. His friendly demeanor sometimes blurred the line between harmless banter and something more suggestive, especially to those who knew him well. Women would joke about his flirtations, and there were whispers that Jake enjoyed the attention. But nothing ever seemed serious enough to raise any alarms, at least not until rumors started surfacing about his relationship with Lila Morrow's mother, Jennifer. Jake and Lila had started dating about a year before the murders. It seemed like a natural match. Lila, the driven and focused young woman with dreams of leaving town, and Jake, the laid back mechanic who had become part of the town's fabric. At first, their relationship appeared picture perfect. They were often seen together at local gatherings, and Lila's friends would talk about how happy she seemed with Jake. But as with most small town relationships, the cracks started to show. Tensions between Jake and Lila had been simmering for months before the murders. According to those close to them, their arguments had become more frequent, with Lila frustrated by Jake's reluctance to support her plans to leave Green Hollow for a bigger city. Jake, on the other hand, seemed content with the life he had built there. He had no interest in leaving the town that had accepted him so readily. Friends of the couple noticed that Jake had grown distant, spending more time at work and less with Lila. There were even rumors that he had been spotted at the local bar on nights when Lila thought he was working late. These small signs of strain in their relationship might have been chalked up to the usual ups and downs of a couple adjusting to life together. But in hindsight, those same friends would recall how Jake's flirtatious nature had never really disappeared, even after he and Leela became serious. In fact, some of the rumors that began to circulate involved none other than Jennifer Morrow, Leela's mother. To those on the outside, the idea that Jake and Jennifer were involved in an affair seemed unthinkable. Jennifer, the respected diner owner, was known for her commitment to her daughter and her quiet, steady presence in the town. But there were subtle signs that something had shifted between them. Regulars at the diner began to notice that Jake would often stop by, even when his car didn't need repairs. He'd spend more time talking with Jennifer at the counter than anyone else, and their conversations seemed just a little too comfortable. Still, no one would have guessed that their connection went beyond friendship. Jake's easygoing nature had always allowed him to navigate these social boundaries without much trouble. He was the type of man who could make a woman feel like she was the only person in the room when he spoke to her, a trait that undoubtedly contributed to his relationships with both Leela and Jennifer. But what the town saw as harmless flirtation would soon reveal itself to be something much darker, a secret that Jake and Jennifer thought they could keep hidden, but one that would ultimately cost them their lives. As the investigation into the murders progressed, detectives began to piece together a picture of Jake that went beyond the charming mechanic everyone thought they knew. His flirtatious personality, combined with his growing dissatisfaction with Leela and his illicit affair with Jennifer, painted the portrait of a man caught in a web of his own making. And while Jake might have been able to juggle those secrets in the short term, the consequences of his actions were fatal. Jake Hanson's life in Green Hollow was one built on appearances. To the townspeople, he was the good natured, helpful guy they could rely on. But beneath that exterior was a man whose choices had led him down a dangerous path, a path that would end in betrayal, heartbreak, and murder. The question that lingered for investigators and for the town was whether Jake had truly understood the stakes of the game he was playing, or whether he had underestimated just how deadly his secrets could be. In the end, the man who had seemed so easygoing and carefree had left behind a trail of broken trust and shattered lives, with two people dead and an entire town struggling to make sense of the tragedy. As the investigation into the murders progressed, the detectives on the case were prepared for a complex motive. Murders like these, brutal, intimate, and isolated, rarely came without a deeply personal backstory. But even with that expectation, what they uncovered shook everyone involved. It began with a simple examination of the victim's digital devices, a routine step in any investigation, but one that would soon crack open the very heart of this case. When the detectives first accessed Jake Hanson's phone, they were searching for anything that could provide a lead. Maybe an angry text from an unknown number, maybe evidence of a shady deal gone wrong, anything that might explain why Jake and Jennifer were brutally murdered in a remote cabin. What they found, however, was far more shocking than they had anticipated. Buried in the seemingly innocent text messages and emails was evidence of an affair, one that no one in town could have ever predicted. Jennifer Morrow and Jake Hanson, two people who should have had a purely familial connection through Leela, were romantically involved. The text messages between them told a story of deceit, secrecy, and betrayal that had been ongoing for months. Jennifer and Jake had been meeting in secret, using a rented cabin outside of town, far from prying eyes, as their hideaway. The affair was not just a fleeting mistake, but a long-term relationship that had involved intimate meetings, emotional exchanges, and even plans for the future. For the detectives, this revelation changed everything. The texts weren't just casual or flirty, they were raw and intense, full of confessions of love, guilt, and frustration. Jennifer had expressed her conflict over betraying her daughter, but her feelings for Jake seemed to overpower her guilt. In one particularly damning message, Jennifer had written, "I know what we're doing is wrong, but I can't stop myself. I love you too much, and I don't know how to let you go." Jake's responses reflected a similar emotional tug of war. He was torn between his relationship with Leela, who he claimed to still care for, and his undeniable attraction to Jennifer. In one exchange, Jake mentioned how difficult it was to keep lying to Leela, noting that the situation was becoming too complicated. His tone in the messages oscillated between lustful and conflicted, but one thing was clear: Jake and Jennifer's affair was more than just a fleeting temptation. It had grown into something serious, something that couldn't stay hidden forever. For detectives, this changed the trajectory of their investigation. What had initially seemed like a possible robbery or random act of violence now revealed itself as something far more sinister. This wasn't a random attack, this was a crime born out of betrayal. The discovery of the affair placed Lila Morrow squarely in the spotlight as a potential suspect. The timing of the murders, the secluded nature of the cabin, and the deeply personal nature of the crime pointed to one undeniable fact: whoever had committed this crime had done so out of passion, anger, and a sense of betrayal. The brutal manner in which Jennifer and Jake had been killed, multiple stab wounds, clearly inflicted in a rage, suggested that the killer knew them intimately and had a deeply personal motive for wanting them dead. The detectives now had to consider the possibility that Leela had discovered the affair. Could this have been a crime of passion, the ultimate act of revenge after learning of her mother's and boyfriend's betrayal? Or had Leela's suspicions been bubbling beneath the surface for months, finally erupting into violence? It was hard to ignore the fact that the murders had taken place just days after a heated argument between Leela and her mother, which neighbors had overheard but dismissed as just another mother-daughter quarrel. In Leela's initial interviews, she had appeared distraught but cooperative, and she had denied any knowledge of her mother's relationship with Jake. But now, with this damning digital evidence in hand, investigators began to doubt her innocence. They wondered if Leela had found out about the affair, whether by accident or through piecing together clues, and if the discovery had driven her to commit an unthinkable act. The affair wasn't just a scandalous secret, it was the key to understanding the murders. The detectives now had to sift through the messages and emails, looking for the precise moment when things might have escalated. They traced phone records, looking for any sign that Leela had contacted Jake or Jennifer in the hours leading up to the murders. The deeper they dug, the more it seemed that the truth behind this crime was more complicated and more tragic than anyone could have imagined. The small town of Green Hollow had always been a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but even here, this affair had stayed hidden long enough to fester. Now, as the detectives followed the trail of lies, deception, and forbidden desire, they knew they were inching closer to the truth. This was no random act of violence. It was an explosion of emotions, the result of a tangled web of love, lust, and betrayal that had spun completely out of control. The revelation of the affair was the first domino to fall, setting off a chain reaction that would unravel the entire case. And as they prepared to re-interview Leela, the detectives braced themselves for what would come next. They now understood that this wasn't just a murder investigation. It was a story of betrayal that had ended in bloodshed. The only question that remained was whether Lila Morrow was capable of taking the lives of the two people who had hurt her the most. As the investigation continued and more pieces of the puzzle started falling into place, the detectives turned their attention to those closest to Lila Morrow. It was essential to understand her state of mind in the weeks leading up to the brutal murders of her mother and boyfriend. What they found only added fuel to the already growing suspicions surrounding her. Leela, by all accounts, had always been a perceptive and sharp young woman. People who knew her described her as independent and determined, qualities that had likely been shaped by her upbringing in a small town with limited opportunities. She had high aspirations and often spoke about her plans to move to a bigger city where she could escape the confines of Green Hollow. But as much as Leela had tried to focus on her future, something had been gnawing at her in the weeks before the murders, the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right between her mother, Jennifer, and her boyfriend, Jake. It started off as little things, subtle behaviors that didn't seem to fit. Leela noticed that Jake had been spending more time around her mother than usual, Of course, it made sense for him to stop by the diner for a cup of coffee after work, but lately it seemed like Jake was there even when Lila wasn't. He'd mentioned that he had a quick errand to run or that he was fixing something at the diner as a favor, but Lila's intuition told her otherwise. Jake's constant excuses, paired with her mother's uncharacteristic aloofness, began to stir doubts in her mind. Leela's close friends, who had known her since childhood, later revealed to detectives that Leela had been increasingly suspicious in the weeks leading up to the murders. She had confided in one of her best friends, Emily, during a late night conversation that something was off between her mother and Jake. At first, Leela didn't want to believe it. The thought of her mother and boyfriend betraying her in such a way was unimaginable, but as the signs continued to pile up, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inappropriate was happening behind her back. According to Emily, Leela had said, "I don't know if I'm just paranoid, but the way they act around each other, it's weird, like they're hiding something from me." Emily had tried to reassure her, suggesting that it was probably nothing more than Leela's imagination running wild. But Leela wasn't convinced. She had always trusted her instincts, and the growing distance between her and both Jake and her mother made her suspicions impossible to ignore. Things came to a head just a few days before the murders. Leela, unable to tolerate the tension any longer, decided to confront both Jake and her mother. It happened at her home, the place she had shared with her mother since her father's death. According to the neighbors, what started as a calm conversation quickly escalated into a full blown argument. Voices were raised, accusations flew, and the heated exchange spilled out into the front yard, where it became clear to anyone nearby that this was more than just a family disagreement. Leela's anger, fueled by betrayal and the feeling of being lied to by the two people closest to her, boiled over in that moment. Witnesses later told police that they had heard Leela screaming at Jake, asking him how he could betray her like this. "How could you do this to me? To us?" she reportedly yelled, her voice cracking with a mixture of fury and hurt. Jennifer, too, was a target of Leela's rage. She had been caught in a lie that no mother should ever have to answer for. The betrayal wasn't just about a secret affair. It was about breaking the bond between mother and daughter, a bond that Leela had relied on for so many years. After the argument, Leela stormed off. That confrontation marked the last time anyone saw her in public before the murders. She retreated into herself, isolating from friends and staying off social media. Leela's absence from her usual routine was noticed, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. The confrontation raised serious questions for the investigators. This wasn't just a case of simmering jealousy between a girlfriend and her cheating boyfriend. The involvement of Leela's mother, the one person she trusted more than anyone else, added an intense emotional layer to the betrayal. Leela's world had come crashing down in a single moment of realization, and the detectives couldn't help but wonder, had that moment of betrayal been enough to push her over the edge? Leela had every reason to be angry, devastated even, but could those emotions have driven her to commit such a violent and calculated act? The argument had left her raw, exposed, and emotionally vulnerable. With her world turned upside down, was it possible that the rage she felt in that confrontation hadn't subsided, but instead festered, growing into something uncontrollable? The detectives were now faced with the undeniable truth that Leela had been aware of the affair, at least on some level, before the murders. The confrontation between her, Jake, and Jennifer was a critical turning point in the timeline of events. The betrayal was deep, and the fallout was devastating. But did it lead to murder? As the investigation moved forward, the focus shifted toward understanding just how much Leela had known and whether her emotional state had played a role in what was to come. The betrayal had been uncovered, the confrontation had occurred, and now the detectives had to determine if this heartbreak had been enough to drive Leela to murder. The timeline of events on the night of January 9th, 2021 paints a picture of a tragic and twisted plan unfolding under the cover of secrecy. What started as an illicit rendezvous between two people living a dangerous lie would end in bloodshed and mystery, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. According to phone records and text exchanges, Jake Hanson and Jennifer Morrow had arranged to meet at a secluded cabin just outside Green Hollow on that fateful night. This was no ordinary meeting. The cabin had been rented weeks earlier by Jennifer under a false name, a clear indication that the affair had grown more serious and more carefully concealed. She couldn't risk being seen with Jake anywhere near town. The false name, along with the choice of an isolated cabin miles from the nearest neighbor, showed just how far Jennifer and Jake were willing to go to keep their secret alive. The cabin itself was located deep in the woods, accessible only by a narrow, winding dirt road. It had once been used as a hunting lodge, but now it stood empty most of the year, the perfect place for a secret meeting where no one would stumble upon them. This wasn't the first time they had used the cabin, as later investigations would reveal. For months, it had become their private hideaway, a place where they could continue their affair without the fear of being discovered by Lila or anyone else in the small town. Jake had texted Jennifer earlier in the day, confirming their plans for the evening. The texts were brief but unmistakable. Same time, same place, he had written. Jennifer had responded with a simple, "I'll be there." But what Jake and Jennifer didn't know was that their plan for another clandestine meeting was about to unravel in the worst possible way. While Jennifer and Jake prepared for their meeting at the cabin, Lila Morrow's movements on the night of the murders became a critical focus for the investigators. Initially, Lila had told detectives that she had spent the night at home, alone, trying to clear her head after the heated argument she'd had with her mother and Jake just days earlier. Her alibi was thin, but at first glance, it seemed plausible enough until detectives uncovered surveillance footage that contradicted her account. Security footage from a gas station located just a few miles away from the cabin showed Leela's car pulling in around 8:30 that evening. The time was crucial. It was shortly after Jake and Jennifer would have arrived at the cabin, based on their phone activity and text exchanges. Leela's appearance at the gas station put her in the vicinity of the crime scene at almost the exact time the murders were believed to have taken place. The footage was grainy but clear enough to identify the car as Leela's. Investigators noted that she had stayed at the gas station for only a few minutes, just long enough to fill up her tank. She wasn't alone, another car was parked in the background, but no one had interacted with her. As she drove away from the gas station and back onto the dark road that led toward the cabin, it became increasingly difficult for detectives to ignore the growing suspicion around her involvement. Despite this critical piece of evidence, Leela's exact whereabouts for the rest of the night remained unclear. She had claimed to be home during the time the murders took place, but phone records showed that her phone had been inactive for several hours, unusual for someone who had been so emotionally charged in the days leading up to the murders. There were no outgoing calls, no texts, and no social media activity, as if Leela had deliberately chosen to go dark. The lack of phone activity, coupled with the fact that Leela's car had been seen near the cabin, raised alarm bells for investigators. It was possible that Leela had turned her phone off or left it behind to avoid detection, a detail that fit the profile of someone planning a premeditated crime. But at the same time, there was no definitive proof placing Leela at the cabin during the murders themselves, just circumstantial evidence that placed her nearby. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they couldn't ignore the eerie coincidence of Leela's proximity to the cabin on the night of the murders. The small window of time between when Jake and Jennifer were last heard from and when their bodies were discovered the next morning seemed to leave little room for doubt. The fact that Leela's movements were unclear added to the mystery. Had she been following her mother and Jake that night? Had she found out about their secret meeting place and decided to confront them, unable to hold back the anger and betrayal that had been festering inside her for weeks? The cabin itself, when discovered by the local park ranger the following morning, showed no signs of forced entry. This led detectives to believe that the killer had either been let in willingly or had already been inside. If it was Lila, as the evidence seemed to suggest, it would mean that she had known exactly where they were going and had arrived with the intention of confronting them or worse. As the investigation moved forward, the detectives now had to consider the possibility that Leela had planned her actions carefully. The timing, the location, and her suspicious lack of an alibi all pointed to a premeditated act, but without more concrete evidence, it remained speculation. Leela's appearance near the cabin that night cast a long shadow over the case. The calm, composed exterior she had presented to the detectives during her initial interview now seemed to hide something far more dangerous. With each new discovery, the pressure on Leela increased. The timeline was closing in on her, and the detectives were determined to uncover what really happened that night in the remote Wyoming woods. The question remained, had Lila acted in a fit of rage, unable to control her emotions after discovering the full extent of her mother's betrayal? Or had she meticulously planned her confrontation, knowing full well that it would end in violence? As the investigation pressed on, the answers to those questions seemed closer than ever, but so did the darkness that surrounded the entire case. The forensic evidence gathered from the cabin painted a grim and terrifying picture of what had transpired that night. When the medical examiner's report came in, it confirmed the detectives' worst fears. This was not a cold, calculated killing, but an outburst of rage and emotion, a crime of passion. Both Jennifer Morrow and Jake Hanson had been savagely attacked, and the brutality of the murders suggested that the killer had been fueled by deep personal feelings. The autopsy results showed that both victims had suffered multiple stab wounds. Jennifer had been stabbed over a dozen times, with several of the wounds concentrated around her chest and abdomen. The medical examiner noted that the frenzied nature of the attack was consistent with a crime committed in the heat of the moment where the killer had lost control. Some of the wounds were shallow, indicating hesitation or uncertainty, while others were deep and deliberate, suggesting intense anger. Jake, too, had been attacked viciously, though his wounds were concentrated around his back and neck, as if he had tried to flee from his attacker but had been caught before he could escape. What stood out most in the autopsy report was the pattern of the wounds. These were not the clean, efficient strikes of a professional killer or someone acting out of self defense. The stabbing had been wild, uncoordinated, and chaotic, with the killer seemingly driven by raw emotion rather than a clear plan. This was not a calculated assassination or a robbery gone wrong. It was personal, deeply personal, and whoever had wielded the knife had been overcome by a flood of uncontrollable rage. The medical examiner also found defensive wounds on both victims, particularly on their hands and arms, indicating that they had fought back in their final moments. Jennifer, in particular, had deep gashes across her palms, as if she had tried desperately to grab the knife or shield herself from the blows. The sight of her bloodied hands and the marks on her body suggested that she had known her attacker. She had been close enough, perhaps emotionally as well as physically, to let down her guard before the violence erupted. The manner of the killings told the detectives something crucial. The killer had known both victims well. The intensity and the frenzy of the attack pointed to someone who had felt deeply betrayed or angered by them. This wasn't a random act of violence from a stranger. It was the culmination of a relationship that had turned poisonous, leading to the ultimate act of destruction. As the detectives turned their attention to the crime scene itself, they found that it too told a story that aligned with the medical examiner's findings. The cabin showed no signs of forced entry, which immediately ruled out the possibility of an intruder breaking in with the intent to rob or kill. The door had been unlocked and the windows were intact, suggesting that whoever had committed the murders had either been let in willingly or had already been inside when the attack occurred. This discovery only deepened the suspicion surrounding Lila Morrow. If there had been no forced entry, it meant that Jennifer and Jake had either invited the killer in or had not felt the need to lock the door because they didn't perceive a threat. Given the secluded nature of the cabin, it was unlikely they would have left the door open for just anyone. The detectives began to theorize that Leela, who knew the victims intimately, could have been waiting for them, lying in wait until the moment was right to confront them. The placement of the bodies added another layer of intrigue. Jennifer had been found in the living room near the fireplace, suggesting that she had been attacked first. There were signs of a struggle, with furniture knocked over and blood splatter indicating that she had tried to fend off her attacker. Jake's body, on the other hand, had been found near the door, leading the detectives to believe that he had tried to escape once the violence erupted. His efforts, however, were futile. He had been caught before he could make it outside, stabbed repeatedly in the back as he attempted to flee. The lack of forced entry and the placement of the bodies supported the theory that the killer had known both victims and had been driven by intense emotional motives. The crime scene, though chaotic and bloody, was not the result of a premeditated break in or robbery. It was the final act in a tangled web of betrayal, with the killer lashing out in a moment of uncontrollable rage. The detectives were now more certain than ever that this was not a random attack. Every piece of evidence pointed to someone close to Jennifer and Jake, someone who had reason to feel deeply betrayed by their relationship. And as they pieced together the timeline of the night, all signs began to point in one direction, toward Lila Morrow. The forensic evidence didn't just suggest a crime of passion, it screamed it. The brutality, the chaos, and the personal nature of the attack left little room for doubt. Whoever had killed Jennifer and Jake hadn't done so for money or out of a cold, calculated plan. They had done it because their emotions had overwhelmed them, and in the heat of the moment, they had lashed out in the most violent way possible. With the autopsy and crime scene reports in hand, the detectives had a clearer picture of what had happened inside that remote cabin. But while the evidence pointed toward a personal vendetta, they still needed more to definitively tie Leela to the crime. The lack of forced entry, the frenzied attack, and the deep emotional connection between the killer and the victims were all pieces of a puzzle that seemed to be leading to one inevitable conclusion. Now, it was only a matter of time before the detectives uncovered the final piece of evidence that would bring the whole tragic story into focus. As the investigation unfolded, all the subtle clues and mounting evidence began to point in one direction, toward Lila Morrow. What had started as mere suspicion was now turning into something much more serious. The detectives had long believed the murders were personal, and with each new piece of evidence, they found it harder to ignore the possibility that Leela had played a central role in the brutal killings of her mother and Jake Hanson. The breakthrough came when forensic technicians discovered Leela's fingerprints on a wine glass and the door handle inside the remote cabin. This discovery was particularly damning because it placed Leela at the scene of the crime, contradicting her earlier claims that she had been home that night. Leela had initially told detectives that she hadn't left her house, but the fingerprints proved otherwise. Not only had she been inside the cabin, but her prints were found on a glass that was still on the kitchen table, untouched by the bloodshed around it, suggesting that she had been there before the violence erupted. The door handle, too, was telling. Leila's fingerprints on the inside of the door indicated that she had either entered or exited the cabin during the crucial window of time when the murders were believed to have taken place. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry at the cabin now made even more sense. If Leila had been there, she would not have needed to break in. She would have known exactly where her mother and Jake were, and they might have even let her in without suspicion, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside her. But the physical evidence wasn't the only thing that implicated Leela. As investigators dug deeper into her digital communications, they found text messages that raised even more red flags. The night before the murders, Leela had exchanged a series of heated messages with Jake. In those messages, she confronted him about his relationship with her mother. Although the texts weren't explicit, there were clear indications that Lila had learned about the secret affair. I know what you've been hiding, she had written in one message. You'll regret it. It was a cryptic but chilling threat, one that took on new meaning in light of the murders. The texts were not the only indicator of Leela's growing emotional turmoil. Neighbors had reported strange behavior from her in the days leading up to the crime. They had seen her pacing outside her house late at night, talking to herself or muttering under her breath. It was behavior that was entirely out of character for Leela, who had always been seen as composed and collected. The stress of discovering her mother's affair with her boyfriend seemed to have pushed her to the edge, and it was clear to those around her that she was struggling to hold herself together.
One neighbor recalled seeing Leela standing outside on her porch, staring off into the distance as if lost in thought. When they asked if she was okay, she simply nodded and walked back inside without a word. Another neighbor remembered hearing loud arguments coming from the house on more than one occasion, with Leela's voice raised in anger, though they couldn't make out what was being said. It was as if the walls were closing in on her, and she didn't know how to cope.
This erratic behavior wasn't limited to her home either. Friends of Leela reported that she had been withdrawn and distant in the days before the murders. Normally outgoing and social, Leela had stopped responding to texts and calls, leaving her friends worried but unsure of how to help. Some of them had even noticed that she seemed preoccupied, her mind elsewhere during conversations, as if she was obsessing over something she couldn't shake. The combination of her suspicious behavior, the damning text messages, and the physical evidence found at the cabin all pointed toward Leela as the prime suspect. The detectives had pieced together a timeline that now made her involvement seem not only plausible but likely. In the days leading up to the murders, Leela had clearly been unraveling. The discovery of the affair between her mother and Jake had been the tipping point, pushing her into a state of emotional turmoil that likely ended in violence. But while the evidence against Leela was mounting, there were still gaps in the story that needed to be filled. The detectives wanted to understand the exact sequence of events that led to the murders. Did Leela go to the cabin that night intending to kill, or had the confrontation simply spiraled out of control? Was this a premeditated crime of revenge, or had it been a moment of rage that resulted in unimaginable bloodshed? Leela's calm demeanor during her initial interview had been unnerving to the detectives, but now they saw it in a different light. Her ability to maintain her composure in the face of such tragedy was unusual, especially for someone who had just lost both her mother and her boyfriend in such a violent manner. It was as if she was playing a part, carefully controlling her emotions to avoid suspicion. But with the mounting evidence against her, that facade was beginning to crack. The investigators knew that they were close to uncovering the full truth. The fingerprints, the texts, and Leela's strange behavior were all pieces of a puzzle that was slowly coming together. But as they prepared to confront Leela with the evidence they had gathered, they also knew that this case was far from over. Leela's motivations, her mental state, and the exact circumstances of that fateful night still needed to be understood. The detectives were certain of one thing, though. Lila Morrow was no longer just the grieving daughter and betrayed girlfriend. She was now their prime suspect in a double murder that had shaken the town of Green Hollow to its core. The weight of the betrayal had clearly been too much for Leela to bear, and as the evidence piled up, the detectives prepared themselves for the inevitable confrontation that would soon come. As the investigation reached a critical point, Lila Morrow's alibi began to crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence. In her initial interview with the detectives, Lila had been calm and composed, presenting a straightforward story. She claimed that on the night of the murders, January 9th, 2021, she had been at home, alone, watching movies. It was a simple, almost routine alibi, but something about it didn't sit right with the detectives. Layla's account was given without hesitation, and though her demeanor seemed appropriate for someone who had just lost her mother and boyfriend, her story lacked the kind of emotional rawness detectives typically saw in grieving family members. Nevertheless, they had no solid proof to dispute her claims at first until they dug deeper into her phone records. The digital trail left by Lila's phone painted a very different picture than the one she had provided. Cell tower pings indicated that her phone had not been at her home on the night of the murders as she had claimed. Instead, her phone had been active near the remote cabin where Jennifer and Jake were later found dead. This revelation shattered the credibility of Lila's alibi, and the detectives knew they had their break in the case. The phone records were irrefutable. Between 8 and 9 p.m. on the night of January 9th, Leela's phone had pinged multiple times near the vicinity of the cabin. This was the same time frame in which the murders were believed to have occurred. While it was possible that Leela had simply been driving through the area or even checking on the cabin, her failure to mention any of this during her initial interview was deeply suspicious. Why lie about something so crucial if she had nothing to hide? When confronted with this evidence, Leela's composure began to falter. She stumbled through explanations, first suggesting that she might have driven near the cabin to clear her head after the argument with her mother and Jake, but didn't remember stopping there. She then claimed that her memory of that night was hazy due to the emotional stress she had been under, but the detectives weren't buying it. Her attempts to salvage her story only made her look more suspicious. The discovery of Leela's phone near the cabin was the tipping point. Combined with the fingerprints on the wine glass and door handle, as well as the damning text messages exchanged between her and Jake the night before the murders, the detectives now had more than enough to move forward with an arrest. On the morning of January 15th, 2021, Lila Morrow was taken into custody by local law enforcement. The arrest was quiet but decisive. Lila had maintained her outward composure throughout much of the investigation, but when the police arrived at her home that day, her demeanor shifted. Gone was the calm, collected woman from the interviews. In her place was someone who seemed shocked by the sudden turn of events, though the detectives had long suspected that Leela had known this moment was coming. Leela was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Jennifer Morrow and Jake Hanson. The charges reflected the severity of the crime, premeditated and intentional. Despite the mounting evidence against her, Leela continued to maintain her innocence throughout the entire process. As she was being handcuffed and led to the police car, she repeated over and over, "I didn't do it. I had nothing to do with this." Her protests did little to change the minds of the detectives. By this point, they had built a strong case against her, one that pointed to Leela being at the center of the tragedy. They believed that after discovering the affair between her mother and Jake, Leela's feelings of betrayal had reached a boiling point. The confrontation days earlier had only added fuel to the fire, and when Leela had shown up at the cabin that night, it was with one goal in mind: to put an end to the lies and deception that had upended her life. Despite her claims of innocence, Leela's behavior leading up to the arrest had raised significant red flags. Neighbors and friends had reported her acting erratically, pacing outside her home late at night and muttering to herself. The digital evidence, the fingerprints, the phone pings, and the threatening text messages painted a picture of someone who had lost control and, in a moment of blind rage, committed the unthinkable. Leela's public arrest sent shockwaves through the small town of Green Hollow. To the locals, she had always been the promising young woman who would one day leave the confines of their quiet town and make something of herself. The idea that she could have been responsible for such a horrific crime was difficult for many to accept. But as more details of the investigation were revealed, it became harder to deny the possibility that Leela had been driven to murder by a deep, personal betrayal. Still, Leela insisted she was innocent. She claimed that someone else must have killed her mother and Jake, though she couldn't explain who or why. Her defense attorney immediately released a statement asserting that Lila would fight the charges and that there was no concrete evidence directly tying her to the crime, despite the circumstantial nature of the case. But to the detectives, the case against Leela was airtight. The physical evidence, combined with her increasingly erratic behavior, pointed to only one conclusion: Leela had snapped. The betrayal of her mother and the man she loved had been too much to bear, and on that cold night in January, she had sought revenge in the most violent way possible. As Leela sat in a holding cell awaiting her arraignment, she continued to proclaim her innocence. But with the weight of the evidence pressing down on her, the question that loomed was not just whether she had committed the murders, but whether anyone would ever believe her side of the story. As the trial of Lila Morrow approached, what had once been a quiet tragedy confined to the small, tight knit community of Green Hollow exploded into a nationwide media spectacle. The sordid details of the double murder, an affair between a mother and her daughter's boyfriend, followed by a brutal act of violence, captivated the public's imagination in a way few cases do. News outlets latched onto the story, giving it a name that would stick throughout the trial: The Betrayal in Green Hollow. Television trucks lined the streets of the sleepy town, reporters eager to capture every moment, every sound bite. The media portrayed the case as a tragic drama unfolding in real time, a story of love, deceit, and betrayal, leading to a gruesome conclusion. For a town like Green Hollow, which had always prided itself on being a peaceful, almost forgotten corner of the world, the attention was overwhelming. Residents, once used to leaving their doors unlocked, now found themselves the unwilling subjects of constant scrutiny, their every word and action under the microscope of a national audience. For Lila Morrow, this public scrutiny only compounded the pressure. Despite her steadfast claims of innocence, the media painted her as the villain, a jealous, vengeful daughter who couldn't handle the betrayal of her mother and boyfriend. Every detail of her life was picked apart by pundits and commentators, from her strained relationship with her mother to the text messages that hinted at her emotional unraveling. To the outside world, the case was a tragic yet salacious story of passion and revenge, but to the people of Green Hollow, it was a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time in building their case against Leela. The opening statements were damning. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of a young woman driven to violence by jealousy and betrayal. They argued that Leela, upon discovering the affair between her mother, Jennifer, and her boyfriend, Jake, had been pushed to the brink of madness. According to the prosecution, the betrayal had consumed her, leading her to plot and execute the murders in a fit of rage. The prosecutors laid out a methodical case, starting with the evidence they had gathered over the course of the investigation. They began with the forensic evidence, the fingerprints found on the wine glass and the door handle at the cabin, placing Leela at the scene of the crime. They explained how the lack of forced entry indicated that Leela had been let in willingly or had entered without resistance, supporting their theory that the victims had not seen her as a threat until it was too late. Next, they presented the damning phone records, showing that Leela had been near the cabin at the time of the murders, despite her initial claim of being at home. The prosecution also introduced the text messages Leela had sent to Jake the night before the murders, which hinted at her growing suspicions and emotional distress. In one text, Leela had written, "I know everything. You're going to pay for this," a message that the prosecution argued was a clear threat, foreshadowing the violence to come. To bolster their case, the prosecutors called on Leela's friends and neighbors to testify. These witnesses recounted Leela's erratic behavior in the days leading up to the murders, her late night pacing, her muttering to herself, and the noticeable tension between her and her mother. Emily, Leela's closest friend, testified about the heated argument Leela had had with Jennifer and Jake just days before the murders. Emily recounted how Leela had been devastated by the affair, describing her as a different person after learning the truth. The prosecution seized on this testimony, arguing that it showed how deeply Leela had been affected by the betrayal and how it had driven her to commit the unthinkable. But the most emotional testimony came from those who had witnessed the argument that had erupted just days before the murders. Neighbors described hearing Leela's raised voice, full of anger and pain, accusing Jake and Jennifer of betraying her. The prosecution used this testimony to frame the murders as a crime of passion, one that had been set into motion by that explosive confrontation. They argued that Leela's rage had been simmering for days, and on the night of January 9th, she had acted on it in a moment of uncontrolled fury. The prosecution's narrative was clear and compelling. Lila Morrow, unable to cope with the betrayal of her mother and boyfriend, had snapped. She had gone to the cabin that night with the intent to confront them, and when the confrontation escalated, she had lashed out, killing them both in a frenzied attack. The forensic evidence, the phone records, the text messages, and the emotional testimonies all fit neatly into this theory, painting a picture of a young woman pushed to the brink by the people she trusted most. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial, with reporters and locals alike hanging on every word. The tension in the room was palpable as the prosecution methodically laid out its case, piece by piece, crafting a story that seemed to leave little doubt about Leela's guilt. For many, it was hard to see how Leela could possibly defend herself against such overwhelming evidence. But Leela's defense team had their own narrative to present, and as the trial progressed, it became clear that this was not just a case of passion and betrayal, but a tangled web of relationships and emotions that would challenge even the most seasoned attorneys. As the trial unfolded, the question remained: was Leela truly the vengeful daughter the prosecution claimed, or was there more to the story than anyone had yet uncovered? The stage was set for a courtroom drama that would grip the nation, with Leela's fate hanging in the balance. As the prosecution laid out its damning case, Lila Morrow's defense team knew they had an uphill battle ahead, but they weren't without their own strategy. In their opening argument, Leela's defense attorney sought to dismantle the narrative constructed by the prosecution, focusing on the lack of direct evidence that tied Leela to the actual murders. The defense's central argument was that while Leela had been at the cabin that night, as evidenced by her fingerprints and phone records, there was no solid proof that she had committed the killings. They pointed out that the fingerprints on the wine glass and door handle only showed that Leela had been present at some point, not that she had been involved in the murders. The defense team argued that this evidence was circumstantial and could just as easily fit into a scenario where Leela had visited the cabin earlier in the day, long before the murders occurred. More importantly, the defense emphasized that no murder weapon had ever been found. Despite a thorough search of the cabin, nearby woods, and Leela's property, the knife used in the killings had not been recovered, leaving a crucial gap in the prosecution's case. Without the weapon, the defense argued, there was no definitive proof that Leela had been the one to deliver the fatal blows. The defense team also cast doubt on the idea that the crime was an emotionally driven murder by a betrayed daughter. They suggested instead that the remote location of the cabin made it a target for anyone hunters, drifters, or strangers passing through. The Bighorn Mountains, where the cabin was located, were vast and frequently used by hunters, hikers, and outdoorsmen, many of whom were armed. The defense argued that it was entirely plausible that an unknown third party could have stumbled upon the cabin and committed the murders. This theory, while speculative, was meant to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. In the most dramatic moment of the trial, Leela herself took the stand. Visibly emotional, she admitted to the jury that discovering the affair between her mother and Jake had devastated her. She recounted the argument she had with them just days before the murders, admitting that she had been furious and hurt. But with tears streaming down her face, Leela insisted that she could never harm her mother or Jake, no matter how betrayed she had felt. I was angry, she told the court, her voice cracking with emotion, but I could never kill them. My mother was everything to me, even when she hurt me. I would never have done this. Leela's testimony was raw and heartfelt, and for some in the courtroom, it was convincing. She portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, a heartbroken young woman who had been caught in the middle of a tragic situation but had not resorted to violence. Her defense attorney reinforced this portrayal, urging the jury to see Leela as a grieving daughter, not a killer. After a month long trial filled with emotional testimonies, forensic evidence, and competing narratives, the case was finally handed over to the jury. The jurors were tasked with sifting through the circumstantial evidence and determining whether it was enough to convict Lila Morrow of first degree murder. For 3 tense days, the jury deliberated. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation as both the prosecution and defense waited for a decision. Outside, reporters and townspeople speculated about what the verdict would be. Opinions were divided, even within the community of Green Hollow. Some believed Leela was guilty, driven by jealousy and rage to commit the murders. Others felt the evidence was too thin and that she was being unfairly targeted due to the emotional nature of the case. Finally, on March 24th, 2021, the jury returned with their verdict. Leela was found guilty not of first degree murder, but of second degree murder. The jury, it seemed, had accepted that Leela had killed her mother and Jake, but they believed that the murders were not premeditated. Instead, they concluded that she had acted in a moment of overwhelming rage, fueled by the discovery of the affair, and had lost control in the heat of the moment. The sentence was handed down swiftly, 25 years to life in prison. As the judge read the sentence, Leela stood silently, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. She maintained her innocence even as she was led away in handcuffs, insisting that she had not killed her mother or Jake. The verdict and sentencing left the town of Green Hollow forever changed. What had once been a peaceful, close knit community was now divided by the brutal crime that had shaken its foundations. The townspeople couldn't agree on whether justice had truly been served. Some believed that Leela's guilt was clear, that she had been pushed to her breaking point by the betrayal of those she loved and had lashed out in a fit of rage. Others, however, believed that Leela was innocent, a victim of circumstantial evidence and an emotional trial. They argued that her emotional state at the time had clouded her judgment and that the real killer might still be out there. Vila's defense team wasted no time in filing appeals seeking to overturn her conviction. They continued to argue that the evidence against her was largely circumstantial and that there was reasonable doubt as to her guilt. Over the next few years, Leela's attorneys would file multiple appeals, hoping to secure her release. Leela, now 23, remained steadfast in her innocence, insisting that she had been framed or that an unknown killer had committed the murders. Behind bars, Leela became somewhat of a mystery. She maintained a low profile, avoiding attention while working closely with her legal team on the appeals process. In letters to friends and family, she expressed hope that one day the truth would come out and that she would be exonerated. But for now, she faced the reality of spending the next decades of her life behind bars, all the while clinging to the belief that she could one day prove her innocence. As for Green Hollow, the town would never fully recover from the events of January 9th, 2021. The once united community was now fractured, with lingering doubts and unanswered questions hanging over the town like a dark cloud. The murders and Leela's conviction had left a permanent scar on the town's psyche, one that would take generations to heal. The case of the betrayal in Green Hollow became a haunting reminder that even in the most tranquil of places, darkness could lurk beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered.